Hello and welcome to this SC Media UK webinar in association with Secure Code Warrior. Today we're going to be looking at the concept of challenges around benchmarking security skills and how to ensure secure by design in the enterprise. How is secure by design done? What are the benchmarks? What hurdles need to be overcome throughout the business? How do you make business leaders care about this aspect? What benchmarks can you put in to know how well your teams are achieving their aims, and what do benchmarks look like? Whole different set of areas that we've just been discussing DevOps, whether that comes up as well, and AppSec, and all these different areas that this kind of does fit around. But this whole thing of secure by design and return on investment to the business, how can you actually ensure that it's actually the business realizes what you're trying to do and how worthwhile it is? So that's our subject for today. Introduce myself. My name is Dan Rearwood. I am the Senior Editor of SC Media UK. This is our first webinar of 2025, and we'd like to thank you all for joining us today. It's been a few months since we were last with you on a live platform, but it's really great to be doing this again and again. Big thanks today to our sponsor, which is Secure Code Warrior. Just before we move on to introduce our guest speakers today and also get on with the discussion, a few little housekeeping points. We're going to be running a couple of poll questions throughout the webinar, so do look out for those. Please do participate. It gives us a good couple of ideas of things that you're thinking about on what we sort of propose as the questions, and also gives us some extra talking points as well, which obviously you can respond to. Speaking of which, if you do have questions, then there is a chat function that you can use for questions. You can send those to us, and either that or just comments about what we're talking about. Always really good to hear the feedback from yourselves about what you think about what we're talking about. And finally, if you're looking for a CPE credit for this, you can get one for attending this webinar. Stick around for the whole duration of our live spell, and you can submit that to your auditing body or your representative or who you are looking to get CPE with. So that's the business end done. Let's introduce our speakers. So joining me today are Matthias Madhu. He is CTO and co-founder of Secure Code Warrior, and also Craig Balding, who is an enterprise CISO advisor and also an advisor on ISO 27001 for tech startups. I never get bored of saying all those numbers in there. I wish it was shorter, but it's a great it's great to have both of you with us today. So before we just push on, let's just maybe just run through kind of the title here before we jump into the first sort of talking point. Secure by design. Let's get an idea of what that actually is here in 2025. What is, in your eyes, secure by design, and how do people interpret it?
So I'm happy to kick it off. So secure by design, it means different things to different people. We actually did a survey. We actually went out and we talked to a lot of people, VP of application securities and CISOs, and we asked them, what is secure by design? What do you think about if you think about secure by design? And interestingly enough, it was not immediately about building software. The first thing that comes quite often to mind is more around passwords and all those interesting stuff, more around network security and identity, and not necessarily immediately to application security. But when we talk about security, which is pretty interesting, because think about it, it's all software, it's all bits and bytes. So if we pushed a little bit harder and you said, hey, you know what, on building software, what is secure by design? It means different things to different people. And we thought it had a lot to do with threat modeling, even though that was not always the first thing that came up to mind when we were talking about secure by design. Secure by design, what we heard in building secure applications was mainly about the holistic approach that everybody needs to chip in and make sure that we do everything possible to create a secure solution. So on the one hand, that means that if there are secure components, we have to use secure components. If there are guardrails to create secure software, we use the guardrails to create that software. If there are people, of course, the software developers, they need to know how to build secure systems as well. And then all of that together with the use of AI and the use of the design of the application, that is for us secure by design. That is for us building secure applications straight out of the gate. Maybe one thing to add is that's the theory. And that's very easy when you're building a new solution. You can start with secure by design, and you can start by picking secure components, and you can start by building a very good architecture. Let's be honest, let's be real. Quite often, we're not starting from a blank sheet. Quite often, we're just starting with an application that's already there. Quite often, that application was not built with security in mind. And quite often, it takes a lot of time to transform that application to something which is acceptable. So secure by design, there's a difference between theory and practice in my view, and it encompasses making sure that everybody rallies around it and everybody wants to create essentially a secure application.
I think that's interesting from the perspective. Yeah, it's like everyone chipping in, because I guess when I you think of me like what's secure by design, or the sort of writing I do, people like me too on a daily basis of breaches and vulnerabilities. I've literally this morning been talking about a vulnerability in something I can't remember, company issue. You must patch immediately. It is the theoretical question. Does anyone go out to not be secure by design? I guess that's the kind of good question. Is do you go out of your way to sort of to not be secure? Surely everyone goes out to be, we're going to be secure, we're going to do everything right, and that kind of thing. So is that do you ever come across that thinking actually you're not doing things right and that you're not being secure by design?
Yes. So the answer is yes. And the reason is actually very simple. If you think about a startup, if you think about a company that is just getting started, they essentially do not care about secure by design. They care about, well, will I make it? Will I run out of money? Can I make something that is a continuous business? So they will not think about secure by design from the start. All they will think about is, I need to survive. I need to survive, and I need to get some money in the door soon, or it will be game over. So yes, if you think about proof of concepts, if you think about new projects, because also in organizations itself, quite often if they start a new project and it's time sensitive and it has to happen, and we're not sure if we're going to continue that project, quite often they do not start with secure by design, and that leads, of course, to a problem when it is a hit, when they do succeed, which is great for them, but it was not developed with security in mind. So that is then when the problems begin, and they're like, you know what, we've taken the wrong components, and it was an initial good idea to get started right now and have something within a month. It may hurt us on the longer term, because reworking an application, we all know the drag. It takes a long time to rework an application and to build some secure components in. And the reality is, quite often, you do not do that when you realize you're successful, because then if your product is used, customers come along, they ask for more features, and there's essentially no time to rework your application. And quite often, an event has to happen. Something has to happen to make sure that you do stop and think back and look back and say, oh, maybe we should build in some components, and maybe we should upskill our developers to making sure that we're essentially know what we're doing and how to create a secure application.
I think that's great. I think that part of me thinks, I just thought of this as we started. It's like secure by design. Well, like insecure by design. Does that ever come across? I guess the other thing is you look at sort of companies like I think the most typically you see the threat reports, the most attacked verticals, which usually I guess financial services, healthcare, defense contractors, manufacturing, construction. Apparently, these companies, they're doing everything right to try and be secure by design. It's in the nature to even if you think about when you cross the road, you look both ways. You don't just go to walk for it. As a human, we're trying to be secure by design, as it were. So that's the interesting one. Craig, let's just bring you in, Craig Balding, so our other speakers today. In terms of the companies you work with, then you see these companies and you sort of think, do you see that sort of effort to be secure by design? Is that what do they understand what they're trying to aim for, or what they're trying to achieve if they're aiming for that, or do you find a lot of companies actually are pretty good at it?
Yeah, it really does depend who you're talking to. So if you're talking to a CEO of a global bank, then obviously their conception of what secure by design means, they're probably thinking, okay, if this guy's talking about this and he's saying it's going to cost X, Y, Z, and we're going to have to do all this upskilling and all the rest of it, okay, they get that it's a big strategic play, and they're probably looking at it in a bit of a checkbox way, which is they're thinking, great, once I've got secure by design, then I'm good to go. And the challenge, of course, is that this is really such a big area. Mateus already mentioned it's like making sure everyone's doing everything at the right time. Yeah, it involves many touch points, many practices, tooling, culture change, all these things. So really, if I'm talking to a startup, CTO at a startup, yes, they're trying to survive. So they're generally getting, even if they've got good baseline controls, let's say, they are more focused on software security and secured by design only if they are creating a product or a service that directly interfaces with the outside world. So, and then you've got to differentiate between, well, is that a security feature of a particular product? In which case, that takes us more towards, is that going to differentiate you in the market? And obviously differentiate you in a good way, hopefully, if you implement it securely. But then there's the broader point, which is their prospects, who are often enterprise organizations, are the ones that are pushing. They're the forcing function for secure by design at some of these startups. And that can be very tricky because, as has been said already, very rarely are you working, greenfield. There's nearly always something already in place. And plus, that code didn't just get there by accident. It was written, by humans, not really AI yet. And those people have got opinions, not just opinions about security, but very strong opinions about software development and how they want to do their work. And so, if you come along and you start talking about secure by design, if you're the first person they've ever spoken to on this topic, you're not going to be winning them over necessarily to the ways that perhaps you think they should be doing things. So it does take a lot of, listening, understanding, okay, how do they work things today? How do we even start talking about secure by design so that we're not just having the 1990s conversation, which would have been, have you had a penetration test? That was secured by design back then. And also, are you using insecure C functions, right? So, secured by design these days is much, much broader than that.
Yeah, apologies. I think I'm a bit blurry as in clicking between my script and the poll that I've just started. So we'll try and rectify that. Unfortunately, sorry, but you can't see me as well. I'm definitely here. But it's probably the Chrome update. It's being secure by design. That's what it is. Just to let you know, we have opened the first poll, by the way, so you should be able to see that on your screen, which is, do you know what a secure by design initiative is? Are you sort of aware of that from your side of the business and understanding what what it is you need to do, as we've been discussing for the last 15 minutes, I guess, or 10, 15 minutes, about what it actually is. And I guess it's an interesting one. And Craig, I'll stick with you for this one. In terms of over the years, do you find that secure by design has changed over the years? Now, you talked about kind of startups and stuff like that, and I guess I could point to maybe a dozen companies off the top of my head who I would think of as being born in the cloud sorts of companies. There's one begins with U, one begins with A, one begins with J, and all these sort of companies where, and I've visited quite a few of these companies where you go in, it's literally banks and banks of developers and coders, rather than, sitting there with kind of vaults of money, or we all presume the way banks work, but missiles around them. But for those kind of companies, do you find that there's been a change in the attitude of secure by design? Do people understand what is sort of what is needed, and what it was once, maybe has actually changed now?
Yeah, so it's interesting because some years ago, I think Mark Andreessen was famous for saying software will eat the world, or is eating the world, and it's very true. So even traditional banks are adopting a lot of the practices that have come out of software shops, particularly from West Coast US. Now, the thing is that I would draw it back to, is the thing that you're writing, is the software you're using, is it primarily a back office function, or is it something which it could be a security product, it could be something where you can talk about ROI really clearly, because you can say, right, the business is going to allocate some capital, they're going to spend some money on an opportunity which they hope is going to generate some revenue and hopefully profit. And so, we talk about return on investment, and that's a really good way to frame it when it's a go-to-market activity. When it's a back office activity, when it's about saying, well, look, we've got to do this stuff to reduce the frequency that we get exposed to a material impact, right? So in other words, we don't want to get breached, and if we get breached, we want the blast radius to be as small as possible. And so then you're talking about really operational risk, and you're talking about the cost of controls associated with that. So again, it's very much kind of who you're talking to, what's the span of control that they're looking at, and that difference between pen test / read this checklist of how to do what not to do often, and then it kind of evolved through to, right, we're going to teach developers how to hack their own software. That works, and it works really well for some developers, but it doesn't work so great for other developers. And then we had, I remember back in a multinational which I worked at, we would have sort of security champions, right? And they were developers who were, imagine in a global enterprise, they were the ones that we would talk to when we needed to push out sort of standards and we needed to push out new ways of doing things. And what we found was as soon as one of those people left, we were starting all over again with a new person who perhaps didn't have much of a security background. And so much of it boils down to skill and about, compounding that skill within your organization. And then those newer companies that you referred to there, Dan, a lot of those, first of all, a lot of them sort of were the pioneers in doing DevOps, DevSecOps, so introducing, security practices into the DevOps approach. So those teams were leading the way, really, I think. And some of those practices have definitely come into large enterprises, traditional ones. Some of those people have been hired into those, and they've really changed the way that things are done. So there's a definite cultural shift for, what would be considered old stodgy businesses in the past, who realized that actually some of these technology first businesses, they're actually a risk in financial services. They're a risk because they can start eating up the bank's business lines by bringing cards, payment cards and stuff to market. So, and if you've got the pace that they have and you've got the security that they have built in, so they're doing it secure by design, they can take over, they go faster than a traditional business would.
If I can pick up on this, so on the ROI things that you've just mentioned, it's pretty interesting that ultimately you want to control being exposed, right? And ultimately what you're trying to do is you want to make sure there's no vulnerabilities in your code. And the way you phrase that, like having an ROI, can also be described as, hey, making sure that you do not have to do rework later down the track. Because ultimately, if you're introducing those particular problems, you will have to fix them, or you have to control that blast radius, as you've just mentioned. So the ROI can also be described as, hey, making sure that there's less rework, that the developers in the future will not have to spend hours, days, even months reworking the code with the exact functionality, because you're not buying anything new with that. All you're doing is trying to mitigate the risk in your organization. And Craig, as you've mentioned, like another thing I would like to pick up on is the fact of security champions. So what I really like with that model is that you're expanding your application security team, because today we have on average one or maximum 2 application security people per 100 developers. That is crazy if you think about it. You essentially have to guide developers on a day-to-day basis, and you have to guide 50 to 100 developers on a day-to-day basis in writing secure code. That's impossible. That is virtually impossible. So a very nifty way to expand your group, to expand your reach as an application security team, is to engage with the software developers. And A security champions program is potentially a first step where you make a satellite, you make some people in the development organization your satellite, and they can help you out with making secure software. Even better is engaging all the developers and making sure all the developers have some notion on how secure systems are created, because then it's more of a blend. It's not the application security team and the developers, and the application security team creates the security and the developers create the code. But if you're able to engage all the developers, it's a blend that all these people are trying to make secure code. If you're AppSec or developers, it doesn't matter. All the people are trying to create secure codes.
I think it goes back to the points of that I was making earlier about no one is insecure by design. I'm unblurred again, by the way. Hopefully you can see me, which some people might be happy about, some not. But yeah, I guess it goes back to the point of who's trying to be, secure by design versus insecure by design. And maybe just one more point on this before we move on to another point and the discussion area is just about, maybe, and I'll stick with you, Matthias, as you know, we're still with you now. We talked about, do business understand this? Do like the senior executives understand this? Because if I was to sort of take devil's advocate, I'd be assuming that, again, any CEO of a company who reads in the SC magazine, obviously, but any other media report about so and so suffered this breach, or it's because of this, and there was, we could think back to some of the big breaches of this. Ignoring the cryptocurrency one because that was a bit of an anomaly, but some of the bigger ones that just happened through whatever happened, the NHS one from last summer. You think about that, and you think about they're reading that and how do we stop that happening to us? And then do they then consider, if someone goes to them like a security champion says, let's try and operate by secure design, are they going to understand what that means? Going to a CEO or a CFO or something like that, and even for a small business, someone that kind of money guy, and then the business leader, do they go when you go in saying we need to operate more secure by design? Do they understand the concept of what it is that the business is trying to achieve?
So yes and no. So I feel my feeling is that over the last years, they do understand better that they need to do something and that they need to implement something to make the organization more secure or secure by design. So I think, and it tickles through, there's more and more regulation that also holds people within the organization accountable if it is not developed with security in mind. So from that perspective, yes, I think there's way more awareness among senior executives that building secure systems is important, is mandatory, and if they would not care, they're actually in trouble. At the same time, I would say no, because I also feel we're doing a very poor job from a security perspective in really explaining to those senior executives what that means. Quite often, we're dragged down into technical details and we lose ourselves trying to explain something in a very complicated manner without referring to the business impact of what that really means. So I feel that there's a lot of companies, security systems that are really, really hard to explain because we make it ourselves inherently hard, and we always tend to forget the business impact of what that really means. So I think in that perspective, we need to do better. And that's also what we're trying to do. We're trying to explain better from an ROI perspective what it would mean. Like if you would train your software developers, what is the ROI on your business? What is the risk reduction on your business? But also how much faster can you go as a business? It's a little bit similar like AI. People say you go 15 to 20% faster as a software development group. Well, senior executives can understand that. They know what that means. They can do the math behind the 15 to 20% more productivity, and they can say, oh, you know what? With less people, we can do more, yada, yada, yada. We more features, more business. Inherently, we're not doing that from a security perspective. However, there are ways to explain that in a very clear way what the impact can potentially be if you're building secure systems or if you're building unsecure systems. So yes, from a very high level, I still think as a security industry, we need to do better from a bottom-up perspective, what that really means and what the impact is on the business. Maybe to give you one example before I hand it back over. So security people, if you think about security people, quite often we say stuff like, oh, we find so many problems and next month we're going to find more problems. Well, quite often that does not align with what you're trying to achieve as a business. If you're a company, ultimately what you want to achieve is you want to have happy customers that buy more of your stuff. That is the ultimate goal. And I'm not sure how finding more problems in code align with that particular goal. You need to find metrics in security that align with those business goals on how to make our customers happy. So a better metric can be, if there is a failure, how fast can we be back up and running? How fast can our systems recover so that there's a minimum impact on our customers? That is a better metric than trying to find every quarter more problems into the code. So that's how we need to all align with the business, so that ultimately those senior execs understand what we're doing and why we're doing it.
That's really interesting, and I think it's. Well, maybe Craig, I'll just come to you straight away. Sort of a person who works with all these different tech companies, and how often. Well, I guess the tech company, you'd think they are probably engaged with the with the business when it comes to security, but maybe not. What's your thoughts on that? Sort of how they're aligned with this as a business risk?
Yeah. So again, see really different reactions and different ways of practice between a tech startup and a large enterprise. So a tech startup is much closer to wanting to find product market fit and ultimately to make their customers happy, right? And so they are going to do pretty much everything they can to achieve that. Now that has got its pros and cons, right? From a security point of view, if a prospect has said, look, I really need you to have X, and X is I need an independent penetration test of what you've done. So I have some sense in my software supply chain that I'm not taking on a bunch of risk that I didn't know about. Now, if it's the first penetration test of a piece of software, that's generally going to find a lot of bad things. Just kind of that's kind of normal. And so then you have the issue of, well, how do you then think about that? So you've just been presented with a buffet of disasters, mini disasters. You're the CTO, and now you need to basically put a time and price on some of this stuff. You have to figure out, okay, which risks do I want to try and deal with? Which ones do I not deal with? What's my timeline? What does my prospect need? So generally, security at that level is a lot of haggling and a lot of what do we need to do to survive? What do we need to do to get to the next prospect? And security is a key part of that because it's what the customer asked for, right? Now that's separate from security companies who have got a different challenge, but we won't really address that now. We'll deal with the normal case. Then you've got the enterprise, and if they're regulated, so if they're healthcare or they're finance, then they are going to be very conscious of how much risk they're carrying, and they are going to want to talk to you in risk terms. They're going to have some kind of risk register. They're going to have some way of knowing what their risk profile looks like. They may or may not know what their risk appetite is. And risk appetite when it comes to cyber risk is key to any sort of funding decision around what do we spend. We've got this budget, so what do we spend it on? There's so many possibilities, so many options. And so kind of knowing what your risk appetite enables you to then say, let's design solutions that enable us to, we're prepared to accept a certain amount of damage or a certain amount of loss, which is very true when it comes to fraud risk. Every bank accepts fraud, because if they didn't, they wouldn't have any customers because their systems would be so hard to use, right? So I always point people, when it comes to enterprise, I always point them, go and talk to the fraud team, find out what their budget is, how much loss can they take, how much can they accept, and then look at some of the projects they did in order to eat away at that fraud that they were facing, right? And so if you think about retail channel fraud, it's a high velocity, small ticket versus commercial risk fraud, on where it's going to be big ticket items, organized crime. Well, there's a lot you can learn from talking to the people that deal with fraud and fraud solutions. It's a different, the nature of the risk is a bit different from cyber. But coming back to the point, you can start stealing some of their ideas about, okay, how do they sort of prove some of their ideas? How do they win over management in terms of buying decisions around some of the products they're using? Now, of course, they can count money really easily because it's quantitative, right? It's a lot easier, but you can then start applying that thinking to, okay, how do we start accounting for risk in our software development? And how do we start communicating what that is? And then remembering that whatever we measure is going to drive some behaviors. So we better make sure we're measuring the right things. And that on the things we can't measure, so the more qualitative items, that we're not forgetting those either, because those are equally as important.
Can I pick up on that? Because I like the last part that you've mentioned on measurement. The one thing that I'm always struggling with myself is we do quite often measurement, but we do not know what the others are doing. Like quite often we measure something and we think it's the right thing, but then the outcome is quite often hard. Like if we measure it, is it good or is it bad? And what are the others doing? Because in security, we are sharing, but we're not sharing to the level where you can essentially benchmark your initiative against others. To just give a very simple example, if you do a scan and you find 7 problems, or you do a pen test and you find 7 critical problems, you may say that is bad, but is that bad? Is that good compared to other companies? Do other companies find 10? And what does 10 even mean? So it's then the interpretation of the risk is also pretty interesting to me, because you never want to be the slowest running zebra, right? You never, if the lion comes, you never want to be the slowest running zebra. So ultimately, you need a point of comparison. You need to figure out what are the others doing, and if you're a CISO, quite often you know your peers. You know 5, 10, maybe 20 CISOs, but that does not mean you can compare everything against those people, because they may be in a different business, or you only get one reference point, and is he or she doing well, or is he or she not doing well? You do not really know. So even with the measurement point, it's always pretty interesting that you can interpret that in a correct way. And then what I'm struggling with a lot in our industry is benchmarking. I want to see more benchmarking. I want to see more like, hey, how do I stack up against other companies?
I think great points. Love the slowest running zebra concept. I think you're right. But I think the challenge here, I suppose, is that how do you know how well you're doing versus someone else? You can put this in any business context. Really, is how someone is prepared to stand up and say, I'm doing things this way, or this is the problem we've had here. Now, you might get a lot like that amongst CISO communities. We are very fortunate in our industry to have closed room communities where people can talk more freely about how the reason they failed their audit or whatever, and that kind of thing, or the problems they've had. We still sort of sit worrisome that people like me are overhearing, and it ends up in the wrong place. But it's a really interesting point. And do you think, maybe just before we move on to the kind of concept more of benchmarking, maybe Matthias, just one more thing, is there a way of enabling that to sort of learn better about how to do things better? I mean, I guess, maybe Secure Warrior provide that kind of service, but is there sort of a way of doing things that actually people can sort of say, X companies doing this, and we sort of, they're in our space, and, how do we do that? Do you see that sort of conversation going on?
Yes, so because I like your point with the closed communities. There are closed communities, but even in that perspective, you may have it in Europe and you may have them in the US, but do they bridge? Do they come together? Or with Asia, do they learn from each other? Quite often you have industries, you have the people in the finance coming together and the people in the technology come together, but do they bridge, and can they learn from each other? So for us, that's definitely something we're working on right now. And the interesting part for benchmarking is we have some really good learnings. So we have some really good learnings because we've done benchmarking. we have around 600 enterprise companies. And we're 10 years in business. So we sit on a mountain of data. We sit on a mountain of data on how people learn and how people acquire skill. And the most simplistic way to think about that is, in the beginning, if you learn something, you make a lot of mistakes. But over time, you're doing better. And we went into our database and we tried to figure out if we could spot those patterns. Can we figure out what a holistic secure developer means? And if you know that, and if like us, we have 350,000 developers on our platform, then suddenly you can figure out like who's a good developer and who's a not so good developer, and in what areas can they upskill themselves. But you can also slice and dice the data, and you can group, for example, all the financials together and have a pretty good picture of what a secure developer looks like in the financial sector. And you can do the same thing for the technology sector, for example. And then the interesting part becomes, because then you can suddenly measure companies. You can see how companies are doing, and you can see how companies are successful with secure by design through upskilling. And you can see companies that are not doing not so well in secure by design through upskilling. And the whole philosophy over there is, so the things that we've learned, maybe I'll come down to the things that we've learned out of our benchmarking exercise. So first of all, we've learned that you can be successful in a large organization with a secure by design initiative. What does that mean? Because a lot of people say, well, small companies, you know, they're nimble, they can do something. But if you think about gigantic companies, the Fortune 100 companies, they cannot be successful with a secure by design initiative, right? It's too big. Well, we've seen in our database that it is possible. It is possible to essentially upscale and control the risk of 10,000 developers, more than 10,000 developers, 35,000 developers even. You can essentially control the risk if you take a holistic approach, if you roll it out company-wide. And there's a lot of tricks, of course, that are involved to make it a success. But you can be successful in a large organization with a secure by design initiative. Does it take long? Oh yeah, it takes a while. Don't get me wrong. This will not happen overnight. If you're in a small organization, it can happen overnight. We've seen that as well. So one of the learnings that we've seen is that with smaller companies, you can be very successful in a very short period of time. If you're a large organization, you know, you can be successful, but it takes a little bit of time. Another learning was, in these large organizations, once it starts moving, it's like a flywheel, and you're almost guaranteed to be successful once it starts moving in a large organization. That was a pretty interesting learning as well. Maybe two other learnings that I would like to point out if you do some initiative like that. There was a big difference for us between the technology sector and the financial sector. So in the financial sector, one thing that we've seen is very interesting. The skill level was kind of higher than in the technology sector, which kind of didn't make sense to us. Like, why is that happening in the technology, in the financial sector? It's better than in the technology sector. And then we looked at the drivers behind the Secure by Design initiative, and we saw that in the financial sector, they're essentially driven by regulation, not necessarily by innovation, but more by regulation. So it has to happen. You know, it just has to happen. They need to be successful with that Secure by Design initiative. In the technology sector, and we've already touched on that previously, it's more a bottom-up approach. It's more like, yeah, if it happens, it happens. And quite often, we're going so fast in new innovations and technology that we just go too fast to catch up with the Secure by Design initiative. And that's why our results from our database, well, they vary a lot. Because in certain technology companies, it is a success. But in other technology companies, it just does not get off the ground. And it has very different reasons why it does not get off the ground. So that's why I'm a very big advocate of benchmarking and these learnings, because if you slice and dice the data, you can have really interesting insights into certain markets, into certain segments of the market, into certain areas, geographical areas. And one can for sure learn about something that somebody else is doing. So maybe one learning out of the benchmarking exercise that we've done is I'm a very big fan of making one thing mandatory. So you have the financials where a big bunch of stuff is mandatory. You have the technology companies where quite often nothing is mandatory. What we've seen is that the best approach is you make something mandatory. Not the biggest thing, but not totally optional as well. But if you make something mandatory, at least you get the thing going and you learn and you figure out what works and what doesn't work. And everybody is on the bus, essentially. Everybody has to join that Secure by Design initiative. So those are the type of learnings that we then get out of the benchmarking exercise.
That's really, really interesting. Thanks very much, Matthias. It's yeah, I mean, obviously the benchmarking is, part of our webinar today was, how to benchmark security skills. I mean, we'll just stick with you just before we move back to Craig. In terms of sort of adding those benchmarks, for someone who's like me, who doesn't really understand how you put a benchmark, what you're benchmarking against, what you're benchmarking, how you're benchmarking essentially, what is it you're benchmarking to try to actually achieve? What kind of things should businesses be saying? Okay, we want to benchmark success rate or something like that, or code pass rate. What kind of things are you actually looking to benchmark at all?
Yeah, so for us, what we're trying to benchmark is, first of all, we want to make sure that we can capture what a skilled developer means. And we can essentially do that right now. We know what a skilled developer means, which means that if you have a group or a team of developers, you can essentially also measure that particular skill and making sure that they have the necessary skill to create secure code. But then ultimately, you can also do that at the company level. That the average of all your software developers can be seen as a number or as a skill set for your organization. So in that set, that's how you can compare yourself against another company. So if you are a financial institution, you can essentially look at your developer pack and say, okay, what is my skill set here? What do I own? What are they capable of, and what are they not capable of? And that's interesting as well, because what they're not capable of, then you can also upskill those people in those areas to make sure that they acquire skill in those areas. But from a company perspective, once you know what you have, you can compare yourself against the vertical and say, oh, okay, so I'm doing very well in this particular area, which is great, but in another area, I'm actually not doing really well. So that's how you then compare your organization in terms of developer skill against another organization. But my philosophy is we should do that more often. So we're doing that from a software developer perspective, but nobody is doing that from a software problem perspective. Nobody is saying, well, you know what, if I look at all my software, if I look at all my bits and bytes, this is where I'm at today. Let's pick a number. I have 7 critical vulnerabilities. If I compare myself against the benchmark in the financial industry, well, I see, well, everybody has 15 critical vulnerabilities. Okay, so looks like I'm doing good. Looks like my software is built in an okay-ish state. It's a silly example, of course, and it doesn't make sense. But that's the direction we need to go into, because right now there's no comparison point. And the same is true for architecture. If you have an architecture and you do some threat modeling, what does good look like? It's really hard. And what do the others do? I have no idea what the others are doing, because everybody is doing threat modeling different. And maybe a last point, how about AI? Hey, we're using a particular AI system and we're getting some feedback, but what are the others doing? And it's really cutting edge right now. It's really cutting edge to use an AI system, but the way you're using it in your organization, can you essentially benchmark that against another organization? Or are they doing better? Are they doing worse? What are you measuring? And that's a whole different level. From that perspective, I have not even given that enough thought how you benchmark in creating secure AI systems. But that is definitely the direction we need to evolve into.
Oh yeah, I think just some more great points. I think I like what you said about benchmarking what you're not doing or what you could be doing better. I suppose is the point of kind of can you pick out your faults and upskill people? It's not just a case of like we need to go and pick up a new head of whatever AI development. We need to go and buy this, spend money, because I suppose majority of companies, yes, they have budget, and here we are right at the start of Q2, but ultimately, how can businesses actually make sure they're getting the best out of what they already have? And obviously, we have to mention AI because it's something to do with cybersecurity. But that's great, Matthias. And Craig, let's bring you back in because obviously lots of sort of digest from what Matthias has been saying. But that concept then of the benchmarking, again, similar questions to what I asked Matthias just now, but to you, do businesses know what they're trying to learn about, essentially what it is they're trying to find out whether they're doing wrong? Or is it just a bit more of a challenge of sort of actually trying to just survive day to day?
So I think if we're talking about, say, a large enterprise, if I go back to, let's say, the 2000s, and we were benchmarking across the whole of General Electric, what the software security practices were like, and because it was a company that had very much embraced Six Sigma, so there's a lot of defining, measuring, analyzing, improving, changing. Those that have done Six Sigma will recognize the DMAIC acronym there. And what we could see there, even then, was just you could see a vast difference between the regulated entities, so healthcare, finance, and the unregulated, because back then G was massive. It was in many sectors. And it also enabled different teams, different security teams to try different approaches, right? So even though it's an old example, a lot of what I see now are echoes of things that I remember either our team trying or a peer team trying in another part of the company. And back then, it was always the rack and stack, which was the CIO of every business entity would be compared against every other CIO of the different business entities against a range of different areas. And one of them would be security, obviously. Now, they'd probably only have 3 or 4 measures, and these were rolled up from perhaps 50 underlying numbers. But it was a way to compare. And what happened was that in the conversations that would take place in light of these numbers, was you'd realize just how different these businesses are. So you'd realize that, and really to Matthias's point, there's a lot of value in having on being able to benchmark, and there's definitely value in having numbers and being able to track where was I yesterday, where am I going tomorrow, and then how am I comparing to those other zebras, right? There's definitely value in that. But what's interesting is that once you get into the nitty gritty, there's a heck of a lot of nuance about business lines, about how we're set up versus how they're set up. And of course, some of it is excuses, right? I mean, just being honest, some of it is excuses. And obviously leaders can be very good at protecting themselves. But what gets really interesting, you fast forward a bit, and certainly it's not just the UK, but the UK is a good example where if you're in the financial industry, if you are a control owner, so if you're responsible in a systemic bank for a key control, you can do jail time if you are basically negligent in your role, right? So it used to be purely civil penalties, and then they changed it to be criminal penalties. And that's when I was working at a large, well-known bank. And suddenly, the quality of the questions that were getting asked about how do we compare, obviously against the standard that we need to comply with, but how do we compare with our competitor over there? Because everybody knows in any regulated industry that the regulator, although they've set a standard, whether it's a set of principles or whether it's a checklist-driven approach, principles being more UK, checklist more kind of US style, the regulator is comparing you against your peers, right? Both at the organization level and in some cases around a particular risk. And therefore, the regulator is not going to say, well, anyone that fails this, it's like you all fail. No, they're gonna go, right, who's the worst, right? Because that's kind of how that works. And so they're going to try and drive change through figuring out, right, who are the really bad ones who we need to try and deal with. Now, if you do that from a software security point of view, you've got a ton of information already. If you're doing on-site development, so your in-house development, I should say, your code repository straight away is giving you big clues as to who's checking in code that ultimately ends up getting discovered to have security vulnerabilities in it. And there's different ways of measuring that, but that's the first place that you can go. But you don't even need to do that. You can just ask somebody in the team, so who's generating the most security vulnerabilities? Either they don't know, in which case you've got a more foundational problem to deal with, which is, okay, you don't know where the security vulnerabilities are, or they do know and they go, well, yeah, we had this guy who and clients were having their pen test teams test it, and we discovered that, yeah, it was perhaps an offshore company. They'll blame the offshore company, or there'll be some other software component that was vulnerable. So they decided to do it in-house, or they chose a separate supplier. So once you start getting into the nitty-gritty of how do you improve the security of a code base, and then of a solution, and then how do you reduce the blast radius? How do you measure time to detect, time to retain, time to respond, which are two critical things. Like, bottom line, these are outcomes. This is not measuring static software vulnerabilities. This is, we detected an intruder after 10 minutes. We monitored them for another 20 minutes. And then when we noticed that they were trying to steal our credit card database, we severed their connection, right? And then took a bunch of other actions. So what you're always looking at is, what are the leading indicators? What are the lagging indicators? Businesses, like business leaders, hate lagging indicators, because they're like, well, you're just telling me what I already know. Can you give me some leading ones so that I can make better choices that align with my risk appetite? And then you come back to that hard conversation, which is, well, what is your risk appetite? How many bad outcomes are you willing to have as a result of your current practices? And you'd say, well, I don't want any. And you'd say, but they happen, right? You do have data breaches. Some of those are caused by your software security practice. And so, these are the kinds of conversations that I think practitioners should be having. And just to the earlier point, I think security teams generally struggle with having the right conversations, partly because it's a very technical subject with a lot of complexity, and it can be hard to a lot of people don't like reducing that down to statements that perhaps sound 50,000 foot or whatever it might be. But unless you have those conversations, and software security is like a really important one, unless you have those conversations, all that will happen is you'll go along with your audit report, your set of findings, and they'll say, oh no, it's him again. He's brought me more issues I need to fix. And it was said earlier, and I couldn't agree more. Yes, in the beginning, you're a friend when you tell someone you love that they've got some problems. You may be a friend, but if you just keep going back to them all the time with, oh, and I found some more problems, and you don't actually teach them how to help themselves, you may be part of the problem.
So, Craig, I think I like it a lot when you say, it's sometimes going back to one or a couple people. One thing that we see is quite often there's no baseline in place. There's no baseline in place where we're trying to control risk across all the software developers, in-house or even outsourced. And if that is not in place, it's really hard to track them down, because also people move on, and quite often the people that introduced the problems are no longer here, so they can no longer fix the problems. And then it's a compounding problem, essentially, because it's a rat race. You're not getting out of the rat race. So one thing that we see quite often is there's no baseline in place. And if there's no baseline in place, then you always have spotty groups of people where some group of people really want to do the right thing. And then there's groups of people that never do the right thing. And that's, I think, what you're pointing out right now. Then it always goes back to those type of people. And you're not controlling the risk because you're not cutting off their access, for example, because you need them. And then you're accepting the risk. So, which is a really, really bad model. Ultimately, what you want to do is you only want to have skilled software developers checking in code. And especially, you only want to have security skilled software developers checking in code. And if they do not meet that minimum bar, you should stop them. You have to say, no, there's a standard here. And we all need to adhere to the standard. And if you cannot live up to the standard, I'm sorry, but there's no place for you in this particular company. And that's my philosophy.
Yeah, it's interesting because where we see that the most is around domain specific areas, right? So you could have someone that is very knowledgeable about a particular domain, and they were either always a programmer or they picked up coding on the side. They can be the most challenging just because they are a key person in the company because of their domain knowledge. And there's many domains like this, and I'm sure we're all familiar with this. There's as soon as you start, particularly in a big company, you start kind of, who works in that office over there, and you go and talk to them and you realize that there's this like really complex thing and they're the expert on it. And so you do have this challenge of really figuring out, how do I get to that person? How do I convince that person to make the shift? And it often takes many conversations. It takes a mix of carrot and stick, typically. And because they are considered a very valuable employee. So it is figuring out, okay, how do we keep them on side without them, the risk that they carry? And it does boil back to that risk balance sheet. How much risk are they carrying on behalf of the organization, knowingly or unknowingly? And then how do we manage that through people management, through technology, through, okay, we're going to do sandboxing around a lot of the stuff that they do. They don't even need to know this, right? But we are going to sandbox the hell out of that because of previous, issues. So, but of course, no one should be that person, and no one's going to, no one is indispensable because ultimately, people can create their companies quite well on their own,
And so that's exactly the result of not taking a proactive approach and not taking a secure by design approach, because that's exactly the result of not upskilling the people when they join the company. When they join a company, they are very open and they are willing to do stuff. And at that point in time, you have them. You have to make sure you get them to a certain level of secure software creation, so that can, throughout their journey in the organization, contribute to creating secure software. But if you don't do that and you wait 10 years, suddenly these people, they are experts in their field, but not in that field, not in that security area where you also need them to be experts. And then it's really, really hard.
Well, great. I mean, chaps, it's we're almost out of time. Actually, the conversation's been really, really, really engaging today between the two of you. It's been really interesting to learn all this, and hopefully, people listening, whether listening live or on demand with us, you've taken a lot from this. Just with maybe a couple of minutes left, Matthias, let's just come back to you, sort of a final thought, as it were. Where would people start then? You talk about the benchmarking and that kind of thing. Is there someone listening to this thinking, I understand what I need to do? What would be the good sort of first point to sort of say, right, this is what the first thing to do is?
So actually, then I'll pick up from where I left it off. I think the first entry point for me is when people join an organization. I think that's when they are the most willing to accept change and to upskill themselves. So for me, it's making sure when people enter an organization, then is a perfect time to make sure that they get the knowledge that they need throughout the journey when they will be coming on board, and throughout all the years that they will join the company to create secure software. So if you're an organization and you want to start with the Secure by Design initiative, think about the future. Think about, and that's also a very interesting point. You have to be in this for the long time. You have to be in this for the long run. If you're in this for the long run, then you should deploy and employ a Secure by Design initiative, because it's going to give you a benefit over the longer time. It's not going to give you a benefit tomorrow or next week, but it's going to give you a huge benefit a year from now, a couple of years from now, 5 years from now. That's when you will see the benefit of that Secure by Design initiative. So from an entry perspective, I think that's where we need to start. From a risk control perspective, I would say deploy some measurement to see how skilled your developers are, and to see how good your code is, and to see how big the problem really is. So from a risk mitigation perspective, getting insights into the software and into your people group is where you need to start. You need to understand where are my critical applications, how good or bad is the code in my critical applications, and do we have the team to tackle the problem? Do we have the skill set, the people that are working on those critical applications, do they have the skill set to fix it, make it better, or at least if it's really good code, to maintain that certain level of secure code creation? So from a risk perspective, that's where I would start. So bottom up, making sure the developers that come on board are skilled. Top down, risk control, have some insights in the software that is created, have some insights in the skill set that you have in your organization, and then you can start from there.
Fabulous. And Craig, I can give you 20 seconds if you have anything you want on top of that.
Well, yeah, I think for anyone that's watching this, if you want to influence software security in your organization, go talk to the developers, find out what their biggest pain points are with your current security arrangements. That could be the desktop, the endpoint. It could be some policy you have. Try and solve that for them and use that as leverage to have conversations with them about how to improve the security of their own code.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. Craig and Matthias, been absolutely really interesting discussion today. And I say, hopefully you're watching this. There's some things you've taken away which have been really useful. Just to let you know, this webinar is available. If you're watching it on demand, obviously you can go back and watch it at the start. If you're watching this live, then you can watch it pretty soon after we've finished. You watch it all over again in case there's anything you missed. Our next webinar will be on 15th of May. That is on is SaaS expanding your attack surface. So maybe you've got your secure by design in, your attack surface is completely clear, so you're okay. But for now, huge thanks again to Craig and to Matthias and to Secure Code Warrior, our sponsor today. And please do check us out, insight.scmagazine.uk.com. We're on Blue Sky, we're on X, LinkedIn, so do join us there if there are any sort of further discussion. My name's Dan Raywood, though. Thanks for joining us, and this webinar is now coming to an end.